Welcome back to the deep dive. We're tackling that source material you shared, specifically a key chapter from Porth's Essentials of Pathophysiology.
That's right.
And our goal today is really to give you that accelerated path to understanding the whole hematopoietic system.
Exactly. We want to map out this circulatory foundation. Blood, it's not just liquid. It's actually a specialized connective tissue.
Connective tissue, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it makes up a significant chunk of body weight, about 7% to 8%. So for an adult, that's roughly 5, maybe 6 liters.
Wow, 5 or 6 liters. And it feels like even a tiny change in that volume or composition can cause huge problems systemically.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly tightly regulated. It really is the ultimate transport vehicle, carrying everything everywhere.
It makes sense. If you get what's in blood and like where it comes from, how it's balanced, then problems in other organs start to click, right?
Precisely. It provides that context.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What exactly is in this circulating stuff? I find the easiest way to picture it is thinking about spinning blood down in a centrifuge.
That's a perfect visual.
Yeah.
When you spin it, the density difference separates everything out into these clear layers.
Right. So at the very bottom, you get that dense red layer. That's the erythrocytes.
The red blood cells are RBCs, and they make up a big portion, about 42% to 47% of the total volume.
Almost half. Just those oxygen carriers. And then floating above that, there's that really thin kind of grayish layer, the buffy coat.
The buffy coat. It's tiny, maybe 1% of the volume, but it's packed with your defense team, the leukocytes, or white blood cells, and platelets too.
Okay. And then the rest, the biggest layer on top, is that yellowish liquid.
That's the plasma. Makes up the majority, around 55%. It's mostly water, looks sort of translucent.
Okay, let's focus on that plasma for a second. You said mostly water, like 91%.
Yeah, exactly. But that other 10% or so is doing critical work. It's carrying nutrients, hormones, picking up waste like BUN.
BUN, blood urea, nitrogen, right.
Right. And it's crucial for electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, regulating osmotic pressure, even distributing heat.
And you mentioned proteins are key here. What makes plasma different from, say, the fluid just hanging out between cells?
It really comes down to the plasma proteins. There are loads of them, mostly made by the liver. They are basically too large to easily escape the blood vessels.
Okay, so they stay put in the circulation.
Primarily, yes. And there are 3 main groups. The most abundant one, by far, is albumin. It's about 54% of all plasma protein.
Over half. Why so much albumin? What's its main job?
Its size is key. Because it generally can't leave the capillaries, it exerts this significant osmotic pressure, colloid osmotic pressure specifically.
So it holds water inside the blood vessel.
Exactly. It's the main factor keeping fluid from leaking out into the tissues and, maintaining your blood volume. Plus, it acts as a carrier for some substances and helps buffer the blood pH.
Makes sense. Lose albumin, like in liver disease or kidney disease, and you get edema because the fluid balance is off.
Precisely. Then the next group is the globulins, making up around 38%.
And these are more specialized carriers?
Sort of. We divide them into alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha globulins carry things like bilirubin and steroids. Beta globulins are important for transporting iron and copper.
Okay. And gamma.
The gamma globulin. These are your antibodies. They're the core components of the humoral immune response.
Got it. So immune function lives there. And the last protein group.
That's fibrinogen, about 7%. It's a soluble protein just circulating quietly until there's vessel damage.
Then it gets activated for clotting.
Exactly. It polymerizes, becomes insoluble fibrin, and forms the meshwork of a blood clot.
Okay. And this actually brings up an important term, serum. How is that different from plasma?
Right. If you let blood clot before separating it, the fibrinogen gets used up to form the clot. When you then remove the clot in the cells, the remaining fluid is serum.
So serum is basically plasma minus fibrinogen and some other clotting factors.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
That distinction is really important for a lot of lab tests.
Good clarification. Okay, we've got the liquid highway, the plasma. Now let's talk about the actual vehicles on that highway, the formed elements.
Right. RBCs, WBCs, and platelets.
And here's a quirky fact. Only the WBCs, the leukocytes, are technically true cells with a nucleus, right?
Yeah.
RBCs lose theirs, and platelets are just bits.
That's absolutely correct. Let's start with the most common ones, the erythrocytes, or RBCs.
These are the little red discs.
Yep, small biconcave discs. That shape gives them a huge surface area for gas exchange, and it makes them incredibly flexible.
Flexible enough to squeeze through tiny capillaries.
Exactly. Their main job, of course, is carrying oxygen. Thanks to the hemoglobin inside them, that's what makes blood red. They also play a role in carrying CO2 back and helping with acid-base balance.
And they don't last forever, about 120 days.
Roughly, yeah. Then they get old, less flexible, and are removed and recycled, mainly by macrophages in the spleen and liver.
Okay. Next up, the leukocytes, the WBCs. Much bigger than RBCs, but way fewer of them, thankfully.
Right, only about 1% of blood volume. But their role is absolutely critical for defense. Immune responses, fighting infections, cleaning up debris, even identifying and destroying cancer cells.
And we split these defenders into two main camps based on, like, how they look under a microscope. Granules or no granules.
That's the traditional way, yes. First, the granulocytes.
Yeah.
These all have granules in their cytoplasm that stain distinctively, and they're all phagocytes, meaning they eat things.
Okay, who's in this group?
The most numerous are the neutrophils. They make up 55% to 65% of all your white blood cells.
These are the frontline soldiers.
Absolutely. Think of them as the rapid response team, the first ones on the scene for bacterial or fungal infections. They have those characteristic multi-lobe nuclei.
And clinically, we watch out for their younger forms, the band cells.
Yes. An increase in band cells, sometimes called a left shift, is a big red flag. It means the bone marrow is pushing out immature neutrophils like crazy, usually because of a severe acute bacterial infection. The demand is outpacing the supply of mature cells.
Got it. High alert signal. Okay, who else is a granulocyte?
Then you have eosinophils.
Yeah.
Much less common, maybe 1% to 3%. They have bilobed nuclei and granules that stain bright pink or red.
And their specialty?
They increase significantly during allergic reactions and parasitic infections. Think worms. They also play a role in controlling inflammation, releasing enzymes like histaminase that break down histamine.
Interesting, sort of a cleanup proof for allergic reactions too. And the last granulocyte.
The rarest of the bunch, basophils. Less than 0.5% typically. Their granules stain dark blue or purple and are packed with potent stuff.
Like what?
Histamine, which causes vasodilation and increased capillary permeability, and heparin, an anticoagulant. They're heavily involved in allergic and hypersensitivity reactions, little inflammatory powerhouses.
Okay, so that's the granulocytes. Neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. What's the other main category?
The granulocytes. Their granules are much finer, less obvious, and they have single unlobed nuclei, sometimes called mononuclear leukocytes.
And who falls under this umbrella?
Two major players. First, the lymphocytes. About 20% to 30% of WBCs. These are the real brains of the adaptive immune system.
Not just one type, though, right?
Correct. There are three main classes. You have B lymphocytes, or B cells, which are responsible for humoral immunity. They mature into plasma cells that produce antibodies.
Okay, antibody factories.
Then you have T lymphocytes, or T cells. These are crucial for cell-mediated immunity. They include helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells that kill infected cells directly. T cells make up about 80% of all lymphocytes.
Wow, the majority. And the third type?
Natural killer cells, or NK cells. They're part of the innate immune system, meaning they don't need prior sensitization. They're good at recognizing and killing virus-infected cells and some tumor cells.
So B cells, T cells, NK cells, the specialized forces of immunity. Who's the other granulocyte?
Monocytes. These are the largest type of WBC, making up 3% to 8%. They circulate in the blood for a day or two.
And then what?
Then they migrate out into the tissues, where they differentiate into macrophages. These are the big eaters.
Like Kupffer cells in the liver.
Exactly. Kupffer cells in the liver, alveolar macrophages in the lungs, histiocytes in connective tissue. They're all part of this mononuclear phagocyte system, sometimes called the reticuloendothelial system.
And what makes macrophages special, besides being big?
They are voracious phagocytes, essential for cleaning up cellular debris, foreign particles, and pathogens, especially in chronic inflammation. And crucially, they act as antigen-presenting cells, APCs.
Meaning they show bits of what they've eaten to the T cells.
Precisely. They process antigens and present them to helper T cells, which is a critical step in initiating the adaptive immune response.
Okay, that covers the white blood cells. What about the last formed element, the tiny ones?
Yes, the thrombocytes or platelets. As you said, they aren't true cells, just small, irregular-shaped fragments that bud off from enormous cells in the bone marrow called megakaryocytes.
And they're one big job.
Hemostasis, stopping bleeding. They aggregate at the site of vessel injury, stick together, and form the initial platelet plug. They also release factors that help initiate the coagulation cascade.
Essential little things? But they don't live long either.
Nope, lifespans is only about 8 to 10 days. So, like RBCs, they need constant replenishment.
Which brings us to... Well, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. How does the body keep this whole complex system running? How does it make sure there's always enough albumin, the right number of neutrophils, a constant supply of platelets,
That's the process of hematopoiesis, literally blood making.
the factory floor? Where does this happen?
Well, it starts in the yolk sac before birth, then shifts to the liver and spleen during fetal development. But after birth and throughout adult life, it primarily occurs in the bone marrow.
Specifically, the red marrow.
Yes, the red bone marrow. In adults, this active marrow is found mainly in the flat bones of the axial skeleton, so the pelvis, vertebrae, cranium, sternum, ribs, and also in the proximal ends of the long bones, like the femur and humerus. This is called medullary hematopoiesis.
What happens to the marrow in, say, the shaft of the long bones as we age?
It gradually gets replaced by fatty yellow marrow, which isn't active in blood cell production under normal circumstances. So the production sites become more restricted as we get older.
Is there a backup system if the bone marrow can't keep up?
There is. Under conditions of extreme demand or bone marrow failure, certain anemias, for example, the liver and spleen can reactivate their hematopoietic function. This is called extramedullary hematopoiesis, but it's usually a sign of pathology.
Okay, so bone marrow is the main factory. What's the ultimate source material inside, the starting point for all these different cells?
It all begins with a very small population of pluripotent stem cells. These are remarkable cells
Why pluripotent?
because they have the potential to differentiate into any type of blood cell, red cell, white cell, platelet. And, critically, they also have the capacity for self-renewal. They can divide to make more stem cells, ensuring the pool doesn't run out over a lifetime.
So they're like the master templates.
Exactly. These pluripotent stem cells then give rise to more committed progenitor cells. Think of them as starting down a specific career path. These are often called colony-forming units, or CFUs.
Like CFU-GEMM for myeloid cells, or CFUL for lymphoid cells.
Precisely. These progenitor cells become progressively more restricted in their differentiation potential until they are committed to producing only one or two specific cell types. They lose that broad pluripotency but gain specificity.
And how does the body know how many of which cell to make? How is production regulated?
It's controlled by a complex system of signaling molecules, primarily hormone-like growth factors called cytokines. These include the colony-stimulating factors, or CSFs, like GCSF, which stimulates neutrophil production, or erythropoietin, which drives red blood cell production.
So signals come in, maybe low oxygen triggers erythropoietin from the kidneys, and tell the marrow factory, ramp up RBC production.
That's the basic idea. It's a tightly regulated feedback loop to maintain relatively constant numbers of each cell type in circulation, responding to the body's needs.
What happens when this factory system goes wrong? Like if the stem cells themselves fail?
If the pluripotent stem cells fail to grow or get destroyed, you get aplastic anemia. The bone marrow essentially becomes empty, leading to a deficiency of all blood cell types.
All types. So that would be
Pancytopenia, that's the term for a reduction in red cells, anemia, white cells, leukopenia, specifically granulocytopenia usually, and platelets, thrombocytopenia. It's a very serious condition reflecting widespread marrow failure.
and the opposite problem, too much production.
Yes, those are the myeloproliferative disorders. This is when the production of one or more cell lines becomes excessive and unregulated.
Examples.
Well, polycythemia vera is an overproduction of red blood cells primarily, but often other cells too. Essential thrombocythemia is excessive platelet production. And the various leukemias involve the malignant, uncontrolled proliferation of white blood cells or their precursors.
And for many of these, because the problem is at the stem cell or progenitor level, the treatment might involve replacing the whole factory.
Exactly. Stem cell transplantation is a key therapy for aplastic anemia, many leukemias, and some other marrow failure or malignant states. You're trying to replace the faulty stem cell pool with healthy ones.
Okay, that makes sense. Which leads us nicely into the final section. How do we actually assess all this? What are the diagnostic tools?
Right. How do clinicians peek inside this system? The cornerstone test is the complete blood count, the CBC.
Everyone gets a CBC, seems like. What does it tell us?
It gives you the fundamental numbers. The count of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets per unit volume of blood. It also measures hemoglobin and hematocrit, the percentage of blood volume occupied by RBCs.
But there's more detail in there too, right? The indices.
Absolutely critical. The RBC indices tell you about the quality of the red blood cells. The MCV, mean corpuscular volume, tells you their average size.
So big cells, small cells.
Right. And the MCH, mean corpuscular hemoglobin, tells you the average amount of hemoglobin per red cell, while the MCHC, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration, tells you the concentration of hemoglobin within the cell, basically, how red or pale they are.
Can you give an example of how that helps?
Sure. A classic example is iron deficiency anemia. You'll typically see a low MCV small cells, microcytic, and low MCHC pale cells, hypochromic. It points strongly towards that diagnosis.
And the CBC also looks at the white cells in more detail.
Yes, the white blood cell differential count. This breaks down the total WBC count into the percentages of each type: neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils.
So you can see if one type is way out of whack.
Exactly. A high neutrophil percentage, especially with those immature band cells we mentioned, screams bacterial infection. A high lymphocyte count might suggest a viral infection or certain leukemias. High eosinophils point towards allergies or parasites. It helps narrow down the possibilities immensely.
Okay, CBC is the workhorse. What else? You mentioned inflammation earlier?
Right, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or ESR. This is a non-specific test for inflammation somewhere in the body.
How does it work?
You basically put anticoagulated blood in a tall, thin tube and measure how far the red blood cells fall in 1 hour. When there's inflammation, certain plasma proteins, like fibrinogen, increase. They make the red cells stick together more, form stacks called rouleaux, which are heavier and fall faster.
So a faster ESR means more inflammation.
Generally, yes. It doesn't tell you where or why, but it indicates an inflammatory process is active.
And if you need to look directly at the factory floor itself,
You need to go to the source. A bone marrow aspiration and biopsy, usually taken from the posterior iliac crest, the back of the hip bone.
what's the difference between aspiration and biopsy?
The aspiration pulls out a liquid sample of the marrow. You can spread this on a slide and look closely at the individual cell types, their morphology, maturation stages, and the ratio of different lineages. For example, calculating the myeloid to erythroid ratio, which is normally around 3.1.
And the biopsy.
The biopsy takes a small core, a solid piece, of the bone marrow tissue. This lets you look at the overall architecture, the cellularity, how much marrow versus fat there is, and can help detect infiltration by cancer cells, fibrosis, or granulomas. You need both, often, for a complete picture.
Okay, that covers the main diagnostic tools.
It gives you a good starting point for assessing blood disorders.
So, wrapping this all up, what does this really mean for you, the listener, trying to grasp this chapter? We've essentially hit 3 huge areas.
First, the liquid matrix plasma, and especially those proteins like albumin that maintain fluid balance and transport things.
Right. Second, the formed elements, the RBCs delivering oxygen, the diverse army of WBCs defending the body in different ways, and the platelets plugging leaks.
And third, the engine behind it all, hematopoiesis, that continuous production process starting from those amazing pluripotent stem cells in the bone marrow, all tightly regulated by cytokines.
Absolutely. Thanks again for sharing the source material with us. Getting a handle on blood is just fundamental.
It really is. It connects to almost everything else in pathophysiology.
So as you continue studying, here's a final thought to chew on, something that ties back directly to those stem cells. We talked about how some immune disorders involve faulty cells. Why is it often necessary to do a full stem cell transplant for these conditions instead of just giving, say, repeated infusions of healthy, mature lymphocytes?
That's a great question. Think about the lifespan. Mature lymphocytes, like most blood cells, don't live forever. If the factory itself, the stem cell pool, is programmed to make faulty cells, just adding functional mature cells is only a temporary fix. They'll die off, and the factory will keep churning out bad ones.
Ah, so you have to replace the source.
Exactly. The only way to achieve a permanent cure, to completely repopulate the entire system with healthy, functioning cells for the long haul, is to replace the cells that have that unique ability for lifelong self-renewal, the pluripotent stem cells. That's the power and the challenge of stem cell therapy. It highlights just how fundamental that self-renewal capacity is.